Hey guys, this is David, and today we're going to learn how to set up internationalization with a Next.js app. To do this, we're going to be using a very popular open source internationalization library called i18next. You've probably heard of it. And we're also going to be able to use Next.js's new internationalized routing feature, which was released sometime, I believe, last year. It's a really great feature that we can use in tandem with i18next very well. So let's go ahead and get started. So all I've done so far is generated a pretty boilerplate Next.js app using the create next app npm package. It's just a single home page on index.js, and it looks just like this here. It's just some static content that we will be editing. So the first thing we're going to do before setting up i18next is just setting up Next Internationalized Routing. So internationalized routing is a feature that comes built in with Next. It just gives us a way to manage our routes for different languages. So the first thing we're going to do is go to next.config.js and configure this. So in here we're going to start with a property called i18n, and it will contain an object with two other properties in it. The first one will be locales, and this is a list of languages that you want your app to support. So I want mine to support English. You'll put the language code in here. And the other language I want to support is Swedish, so the language code for that is SV. And then the next property we're going to be adding is one that's called defaultLocale. And I'm going to set that to English. So the default locale is kind of like your fallback locale, meaning if someone came to your app with their browser settings set to Japanese or another language that we don't support, it will fall back for them to our default locale, which will be English. So the first thing you want to do anytime you edit your next.config.js file is restart your server, so let's go ahead and do that. And let's go ahead and check how we access what page or what locale our user is on. So the way that we access the language that our user is using is through the router object from Next. So the way that you access that is through getStaticProps or through getServerSideProps, but we're going to be using getStaticProps here. So I'll say export function getStaticProps, and we'll return an object with props that will be passed into our component here. So if you're not too familiar with getStaticProps, I'd recommend reading up on it, but I'm just going to assume you do. So all we have to do is take the locale out of here. The locale is passed into an object in getStaticProps, and we'll just say locale. So now our getStaticProps will pass the locale as props into our page components. So if I put props here, we can actually render what locale we're on to the screen just by doing something like we'll put a h2 tag here and say props.locale. Locale. There we go. Now when we go to our app, we should see our language. So my default language is English, and also my browser language is set to English, so I'm on the English route. If your user came to your app in Swedish, which is another language that we support, then they will see this route here. They will automatically be directed to the /sv route for Swedish, and your page will know that you are on the Swedish language based off the locale prop that we passed in. So that's what internationalized routing does for us. It gives us routes to different languages so that we could use this language to render the proper translations to our page. And it automatically redirects users based off their browser language to the correct route automatically. So if you want, you could just use this locale that we pass in and conditionally render the correct translation based off that locale, but that's what i18next does for us, so that's why we're going to be using that. So let's go ahead and install i18next. So I'm going to npm install, and we're going to be using next.i18next. It's a version of i18next specifically written for Next.js. So let's configure i18next. First thing we need to do is add a configuration file to the root of our app. This will be called the next.i18next.config.js. And here it'll be very similar to the next.config.js. We're going to do module.exports equals, and we're going to use the same exact i18n object we did in next.config.js. because i18next also needs to know which locales and default locale that we're using. So it's quite annoying if you want to add another language or change any of these values. You have to do it in two different places. So a quick way to handle that is to simply import from next.i18next config into the next config. So I'm just going to delete this from the next.config.js, and I will import it from our other file like this. Oops. So I'm going to import it from next.i18next.config, and then we could simply use it just like that. So now we're only managing these languages in one place instead of two. The next step we need to do for setting up i18next is editing our app.js file. So here we're going to use a higher order component that we get from i18next called appWithTranslation. So we'll import it. It's called appWithTranslation from next.i18next. And then we're going to wrap our app with that higher order component. appWithTranslation, my app. So this is just the last bit of configuration we need for i18next. The appWithTranslation higher order component will provide the i18next instance to all of our pages through my app, and we'll pass it in as props. You don't really need to understand it too much. This is just a piece of the configuration that you need to work with next.i18next. So now that we have i18next configured, the next step is to actually render different translations to our page depending on the language the user is using. So next.i18next expects all of your translations to be in different JSON files inside of your public folder here. Now that is certainly one way to do it if you want to manage a bunch of different translation JSON files and then one day send them off to a translator to go and translate them. But there's a much better way to do it now, and that's through an app called i18nexus. So let's go to our browser, go to i18nexus.com, sign up for a free account, real easy. I've already signed up, so let's go to my dashboard. And your dashboard will look just like this, asking you to add languages to your project. The first language here is your base language, so this is going to be the same as your default language that you added in your next.config.js, so that's going to be English for me. And then add any other languages that you added to your locales list in your config. So in our case, I only added Swedish, so I'm going to search Swedish, there it is. And you could really add as many languages as you want, but since we just have these two in our Next.js app right now, I'm just going to work with these two at the moment. So let's go to our project here. And this is the page we're going to be adding all the strings that are going to appear in our app. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is the namespaces drop down up here. So i18next uses what are called namespaces to separate your strings into different files depending on page or type of string. It's really up to you how you want to use namespaces. You could even use one namespace for your entire app if you really wanted to. But with next.i18next, it's convention to create one namespace per page in your app. So that means all of the pages in your pages folder here. In our case, we only have one, index.js, which is our home page. And it's also convention to create another namespace called common for all the common strings in your app. So that would be for all the general strings like OK or cancel, things you see across multiple pages. So first thing we'll do here is rename this default namespace that i18nexus gives us, and we'll call it common. So this will be our common namespace. And then like I said, we're going to add one namespace per page. In our case, there's only one page, and we'll call that home. So now that we're in our home namespace, let's go ahead and add our first string to our home page. So when we click add string, we get three different fields here. The first one is the key, and this will be used to just reference this string in our code. So the user is not going to see this. This is just for your own reference. So I'm going to create a key called welcome message. So this string will be just a string that welcomes users to our app. The value, which will be rendered to the user, will say, welcome to my app. And then lastly, we have the details. We're going to leave this blank. It's really used for when you get to the point that you're inviting professional translators to edit and translate these strings. You can give them more detail into what this actually means, but I think this is pretty straightforward. They'll understand. So let's click Save. So now that we've added our first string, we can actually click this little drop down arrow here and see that i18next has automatically translated it to Swedish for us using Google Translate. If we had other languages that we added to our project, it would have also translated to those languages as well. So this is really cool because now we can actually see what our app would look like in other languages prior to going out and hiring professional translators to do that for us. So if you were editing the JSON files yourself inside of your project directly, you would just have empty strings for all these other languages. So this is a really cool way to automatically see what it could look like in other languages first. So now let's go ahead and connect these translations to our app. So I'm going to go to the Exports tab here, go to the Exports and Versions. And here we have three different tabs for different libraries and frameworks. So for React, i18next actually has an API that you can hit to receive JSON of your strings for a specific language or namespace. But with Next.js, since we're dealing with more of a static website and it's less of a single page application, it's much better performance to actually download your strings to your application for Next.js. So we're going to be doing that. So if you wanted to, you could just click this download button, download all the JSON files, and drag them into your public folder here for i18next. But there's a much better way to do it with the i18next CLI to just download it for us. So you can see here it gives us a nice little snippet that we already wrote for ourselves, but if you hadn't written this yet, you could just copy this and paste it in there. But what we're going to do is npm install the i18next CLI and then just run the simple command to pull with our API key, which is also up here, and it will pull those strings to our project. So we can bundle our translations with our project so that Next doesn't have to go retrieve them when your users are loading the page. It's much better if we bundle them with our app. So let's go to our terminal and we will npm install the i18next CLI. We do that globally. You usually want to install CLIs at a global level. And then we will immediately after that pull our strings using the pull command with our API key for this project. Just like that. And make sure you are in your project directory when you do this because it downloads directly into your public folder. So this is the exact structure that next-i18next expects. It expects your JSON files for your translations to be inside of your public folder in another folder called locales, and then inside of there we have a folder for each of our languages, and inside of each of these folders we have the namespaces as JSON files. So if we look here at home.json in our English folder, we will see our English translation. If we go to our Swedish folder to the home JSON file, we see our Swedish translation. So let's render our translations to the screen. So what we're going to do now is import a function in our home component called severSideTranslations, and we're going to import that from next.i18next, severSideTranslations. And according to the docs, it's best to import it from next-i18next / server-side-translations, just like that. So the server-side-translation function was designed to be used inside of getStaticProps. So you're going to be using this instead of getStaticProps on every page level component. So we're going to be using it on the home page. What it does is it basically takes the locale, takes the namespaces that are required for this page, and it fetches all those strings from your JSON files using i18next. So let's see how that works. We're going to be using the spread operator and then calling it with await server-side translations, just like that. And the first argument here is the locale that we're getting passed in by getStaticProps. And we're also going to pass in the namespaces required for this page specifically. So we're going to be using our home namespace. If you had other namespaces that had strings on this page as well, you'd include them here. But having this array just prevents you from having to load all of your translations for all of your pages if your user's just loading this page right now. And of course, the last thing we have to do here, since we're using await, is put async over here. All right. So now that we have our server-side translation function set up, we have all of our translations ready to render to the page. So what we're going to be doing now is importing a hook for rendering our translations, and that hook is called useTranslation. We're going to import that from next-i18next. And when we use this hook, we are provided a function that allows us to pass in a key and get the correct translation based off of our locale. So what we're going to do is destructure out that function from the hook, like so. So the function is called t. You structure it out that way. So now we have this function t that we will pass in our strings key as the first argument, and we'll go ahead and render it here. So let's just delete this other default welcome message and add our own. So we're going to call t, and when we pass in our key, which in our case, if you recall, is welcome message, first thing we need to do is type in the namespace that it's inside of, which is home, and you put a colon like that, and then the key like so, welcome message. And one other thing I'm going to do is delete this props.locale that we were looking at earlier. Alright, so let's go ahead and save that. Let's go and start up our server, npm, no not start, run dev. And now let's check out our app. There it is, welcome to my app. So our string has been rendered to the page using the English translation because my browser language is set to English. If we wanted to see it in Swedish or any other language that we support, just put /sv at the end, and boom, there it is, our translation that i18next has generated for us with Google Translate, and it is ready to go. So if any Swedish user visits your app, they will automatically be redirected to the /sv route and view all of your app in Swedish. So it's kind of important to understand the difference between what Next.js is giving us with internationalized routing versus what i18next is doing. So this /sv here, that's completely generated by Next.js when we configured all of our language inside of the next.config.js. So it will automatically handle all the routing with /sv. If a Swedish user were to click a link on this page to go to another page in your app, it would retain the sv and just put the rest of the path afterward. And then all that i18next is doing is it's reading this value here and rendering those proper translations to the page for us. So there's definitely a little more detail that we could go into as far as what if a user has their language in Swedish but they want to change it manually themselves by a drop-down or something like that. You can take a look at the Next.js docs under Internationalized Routing and they'll show you exactly how to do that. We won't go over that in this tutorial, but it's worth taking a look at later. So now we have an internationalized Next.js app for Swedish and English. And we also get this awesome Google Translate feature from i18nexus. So I definitely recommend taking a further look at i18nexus for just managing your translations down the line as well. Google Translate obviously isn't always 100%. You always want to bring in professional translators for when you go to production. So i18nexus also makes that pretty easy. You could basically just go here and add your translators to your project. And what your translators would basically see is this UI here. You can view it under Translator View. They just get a big list of all your translations, and they can edit and confirm them and let you know when they're done. So that's obviously a much better way than just emailing them a bunch of JSON files and hoping they retain the same structure and didn't mess anything up. So this is definitely the way to go, and I highly recommend it. Anyway, I hope this tutorial was very informative and you learned a lot, and feel free to leave any questions in the comments, and we will see you next time.